Welcome to Talks with Summer, seeing the world through the eyes of another. Today I have with me Conor Nixon. Welcome, Conor. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, Summer. Good morning, and thank you for inviting me onto your podcast. So, as I think you know, I am actually a scientist. I'm working in Washington for NASA, and a lot of my career has been focused around the space exploration. And of course, there's a lot of other aspects to my story, including that I didn't originally grow up here. I grew up in a different country, so I had to make my way here and start my career here.
Where did you grow up? Tell us a little bit about your childhood days.
Yes, of course. I don't know if you can hear anything from my accent. It's
Yes.
it's changed a little bit over time, but I grew up in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, in the city of Belfast, which some of you may be familiar with. It's where they used to do a lot of shipbuilding, including the famous Titanic and other ships were built there in the old days. So that's where I grew up. That was the city that kind of shaped my early part of my life. And I did my childhood there and school years, and then stayed there until I moved on to college.
Is there any incident which you would like to share which shaped your life?
Yeah, there's some different incidents, things which shaped my personal life, I would say, and also my career life and goals. And I would say growing up in Northern Ireland at the time was a very small, insular kind of community. And you felt very isolated from the rest of the world because, of course, you're on this island, and on top of that, you're in this small part of the island, which is cut off from the rest of the island culturally. So for me, growing up, I was always had my eyes set on bigger horizons and reading a lot of fiction, of course, and science fiction. I remember going with my mother to watch the very first Star Wars movie when it came out when I was just very young, and being enthralled and also slightly terrified by this movie with these wars going on and everything. But it seemed very exciting. And of course, this whole idea of Hollywood and space, I think, became ingrained in my psyche at that point. And then another incident I would highlight is later on, when I was older, when I was a teenager, and watching these TV shows with this famous science communicator, Carl Sagan. He was very well known in the 80s as a space enthusiast and science communicator. Of course, he was also a professor himself. And he really, I think he had an effect on a large number of people who grew up like me to want to go and join this space exploration. So I think that's the point when I realized that it might actually be possible for me to get involved in this myself.
What is something which is very close to your heart, or what is something you're passionate about?
I talked about some of my enthusiasm, passion for space exploration. I think outside of that, my main passion in life, of course, I have a family, and spending time with them is very important to me as well. Having those family moments, family meals and everything is really grounding, I would say, in your life. And another thing I'm passionate about actually is Irish culture and Irish literature and music and so on. And I spend as much of time possible trying to stay connected through reading and listening to music, and even still visiting my homeland. So that's something I would say I'm quite passionate about. And every year, of course, in the springtime, it's very big for Irish culture for a number of reasons. We have this St. Patrick's Day, which I think has become a very commercialized festival over time. But for me, actually, the highlight of the spring for the Irish culture is there's a very big kind of rugby tournament which happens every year across the UK and Europe, and Ireland is a very competitive team in that. So it's a big part of my heritage to go and find places to watch those games with friends, Irish friends.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the space exploration and your work side of things? That was the one thing which I found very interesting when we had the brief conversation, as someone who believes in the unknown, and then I had your perspective. It really made me think. So can you tell someone who's listening what it is all about?
Of course, yeah, I'd be happy to. I always love talking about space, which to me, it's a job, of course. is a day job, but it's also a passion. And I think I'm lucky in that respect that I'm not doing a job which I'm just doing to get a paycheck, right? I'm doing something which I feel like when I get up in the morning and I'm doing some analysis or space research, I'm excited about it. And I feel like almost I'm lucky to be getting paid to do something which I really enjoy. In particular, for me, there's many different parts of my field, different aspects. Of course, we have people who study the big questions about the origin of the universe and cosmology and black holes and these type of questions in physics. For me, it's more about the quest to understand life and why is there life on the Earth and is there life on the other planets. I know this is something which fascinates a lot of people, and I'm lucky to be involved in this quest myself. So it's this field that we now call actually astrobiology, which is really, there's two parts of the field. First of all, how did the life start on the Earth? If you want to take a scientific exploration of the origin of life. And second of all, is it unique? Is there other life out there in the universe on other places? How did it get there? And is it connected to our life? Is it part of the same origin story, or is it that there were multiple origin stories? So this is really where my research and my science is taking me these days.
And do you believe that there's life on other planets?
Oh, that's one I get asked all the time. And for me, it's still a very open question, actually. I take a very open-minded approach to it. And one thing I can tell you is, I think there's a high possibility that within our solar system, we now know that there are some other places, actually, mostly in the outer solar system, these kind of icy moons, which have oceans trapped inside them, oceans of water trapped inside them. This is something we didn't know even, or barely suspected like 25, 30 years ago. Now we know this for sure. So it seems to me it's very possible, if not probable, that there is some sort of life that could have arisen and be inside those places. Because if there's not, it opens so many questions about then why did it happen on the Earth and not in these other places. So that seems quite likely to me. As far as the intelligent life and the aliens and so on, I almost just turn my mind away from this question because it seems impossible to answer without more data.
I was very curious to ask you one question when we first talked, and there wasn't enough time. But life, it has so many ups and downs. And then for someone like me who does have a belief in the unknown or God or whatever, when something happens, we generally tend to look out towards some other power to help us, to save us, or something like that. And I thought about this when I was going to interview you, that why am I also fascinated by space? Is it the vastness, or is it that the whole infiniteness makes me feel that there is something other than me out there? So, because I know I talked to you a little bit about, I think you don't believe in God. So how do you approach life in such situations when I'm sure life brings its ups and downs, and in those moments, there are times when we feel that if there was help or if something like that, if that's clear.
Yes, it is a great question. I'm sure many of your listeners are probably on both sides of the fence. Some are maybe deeply religious and some are maybe not. And actually, I find a lot of people can hold both sides in their mind. I meet other scientists at NASA who are both scientists, but also religious adherents as well. For me, I find that surprisingly, and this may be surprising to a lot of people, science provides quite a lot of comfort, actually. It provides a sort of rationality, and that our planet can be very irrational. People themselves can be very irrational. But believing that there are some kind of basic ground rules of the universe, I don't believe it's quite like clockwork as it was thought to be during the early years of scientific discovery. But there is a certain functioning there, and it's quite comforting to me, and also the thought that life is much bigger than human life. So long before there were humans, in my scientific understanding, there were many other species inhabiting the Earth. There was whole continents of plants and animals and all this stuff. And if something happened and all of the humans were just vanished in the blink of an eye today, the world would keep going quite happily with all its fish and marine life and antelopes and gazelles and giraffes roaming across the savannas, and maybe even a lot more happy than they are now with us in their way, getting in their way. So it's quite comforting to me to think about the rest of the universe and the rest of the biosphere and everything. And the importance of humans is not as much as we sometimes think. And this kind of keeps us in our place, I think. And for me, it's comforting in a way to think that there's not that much responsibility, that we're the only thing that matters.
Who has been the most influential person in your life, and how have they impacted you?
Oh, this question is a tough one, because I think there's been different turning points in my life, and there's been different people involved. I remember at a young age playing chess with my grandfather, and that brought a whole new dimension to my life in terms of really trying to think logically and starting to read books about chess theories and so on. And this brought me, I would say, into more fascination with mathematics and so on. There's certainly some teachers that were very influential. I remember having a teacher of astronomy when I was in my last years of high school who helped to turn me in that direction. So those people have been very influential. And of course, I mentioned this science communicator, Carl Sagan, who opened my eyes, I would say, to the fact that I think up until that point, I thought that maybe astronomy was a very remote science. You see these very distant objects, these kind of pinpricks of light in the sky, but it's very remote from our experience. But I think what he brought to the world in that period of 1980s, especially during these Voyager mission days, was the fact that we can actually reach out and touch these stars or planets, as you will. They're not just some distant source of light in the sky, right? We can actually send a spacecraft there, and it can fly, or it can even land in some cases, and send us back data. And then these places become more like a real place, not just an imaginary place from an astronomy book. It's somewhere that we're seeing like video footage of the surface of Mars or something, like some dusty desert. And then we can imagine that there's now these other places that we can go to explore, which seems very exciting.
There's another question which came to my mind, was that does it happen like ignorance is bliss? For example, you know so much more about the workings of outside of the world, outside of the earth, and someone like a common layman doesn't know what's going on and how normal functions are working, things that are going right and the things that would also go wrong. Does it add on to the fear element at times? Or does it give you comfort?
I think it can be both. Yes, it can be both. For example, you could take the example of flying in an airplane, right? So some people are very scared, for example, of flying. And I think that understanding the mechanics and the physics of flying for me makes it, in some ways, can make it a little bit less fearful than it would otherwise be. For example, I know that some people are particularly worried that one wing of the airplane will just fall off. It will just break off, and then it will be a disaster. But they don't understand that actually the two wings are connected through the middle of the body. So it's actually quite a robust, strong piece. And I don't know of any flight incidents I can ever think of that were caused by the wing of something breaking off, at least since the very, very early days of flight. So that can help, but maybe you're right in some ways. It can also, you realize that our world is quite a fragile place. And for me, especially being a scientist of worlds and atmospheres and planets and so on, you understand that everything can be quite connected. And even though our world seems very big, I think humans as a whole underestimate how much impact we can have, impact with pollution of the atmosphere and the oceans. I think there's people that can, without an understanding of science, can turn a blind eye to this and imagine these things are happening without our impact. But it's very clear that, for example, we're destroying coral reefs, for example, through warming of the oceans and changing the ice sheets at the poles of our planets. So having that understanding definitely makes you aware of everything you're doing can have an impact. So I think I can go both ways.
You told us earlier that you traveled and you lived in different countries. What led you to Washington, D.C.? Was it your work, or was it something else?
When I was younger, actually, one thing I didn't mention is part of my family, my mother's brother and his family, they all emigrated to the United States. So I had that history of going back and forth a little bit for vacations. Opened my eyes to this side of the Atlantic Ocean. But yes, when I was growing up, as I mentioned, living in Northern Ireland is quite a very small community and limited possibilities for what you can do with your life. So I went on from there to move over to England in the UK and went to a couple of different universities there and did my studies there and got exposed to a lot more different people and different ideas and different cultures. I felt like at that stage I was growing my horizons a lot. And then there's a certain point where even I felt like that horizon had reached its limit for me, that I had seen many parts of the UK and I'd seen the size of that scientific community at the time, which was not very big in my field. And I saw that the horizons were much, much bigger in the United States. The number of people working in the field that I was involved in, the number of different research institutions, the number of conferences and meetings and opportunities there, and just, of course, the amount of financial participation. And, for example, NASA, we talked about being a very big player. At the time, almost really the only player in that time, if you go back a couple of decades, doing this kind of planetary exploration. The European side was very small at the time. It's bigger now. At that point, that really led me to want to move to the United States in some way and join this very big community of people who were studying the solar system. And it's probably a little bit of coincidence just where I fell in Washington. Probably other places I could have landed in, but this is where I got offered the job, and I had a bit of a connection here from my doctoral studies to the NASA institution here. So that was a natural pathway. And I also thought that being on the east coast of the United States was just a little bit closer to home, so I could get back. So that was maybe another factor that led me to landing in Washington, D.C., rather than landing up somewhere in the West Coast.
Is there any advice you would give your younger self looking back at your life now?
Yeah, I took some wrong turns, or I wouldn't call them exactly wrong turns, but I think everybody makes some changes. I made a couple of career changes at different points. And one person once explained it to me like, in your life, you're like a blind person who's following like a chain, and you can only see the next link of the chain. So you have to just reach for the next link, and you don't know where the end of the chain is going to be. And I think that's a good way to look at it. You look for the next step, not necessarily the end goal. So I would say follow your passion. And for my younger self, I would say don't be so discouraged by looking at people who are very far ahead of you in their career or their life, and just look for like the next incremental step which you can take. And that gives you a lot more confidence, and just believing in yourself is very important. Not letting, I think all the time you will hear criticism from other people, no matter what field you're doing, no matter what you're doing with your life. It's good to give those things a listen, but not always to believe them.
What do you feel the purpose of life is for you? Or in other words, what do you feel is your personal quest in life?
So I feel that my life is really based around making some scientific contributions. That's what I would like to be remembered for. If I advance my field in some meaningful way, then I think that would give me some good thoughts looking back at the end of my life, that I made some good contributions. I think you also have to be happy in the day-to-day things as well. You can't always have some lofty goals that if you don't reach them, you'll never be fulfilled. I think it's important to be fulfilled in your day-to-day interactions with other human beings and try to bring some happiness and peace to those around you. But yes, I think my goal or my quest is, even if I don't reach this goal of understanding the origins of life, just being involved in this pursuit itself is exciting. And if I can add some contributions to that, I would feel very happy.
So I'm curious that what brought on your interest in, like you said, the origins of life?
Yeah, that's maybe something that evolved a little bit during my scientific career, so that over time I became more focused on this question of astrobiology. And at the start of my career, I was more focused actually on planetary weather, so like weather on Jupiter and Saturn and this type of things. And then over time, I really wanted to pursue only the things. I realized you have a limited time in your career. You can't go after every question. So you have to focus. And for me, the focus became increasingly, how does life begin in a scientific sense? Can you understand, even understanding what life is, and is there a point when something becomes complex enough to become life? Reading some books made me think very deeply about these questions. For example, if you take something like a virus, it's something which is entirely dependent on having a host. So could it be considered an independent form of life? Probably not, but it does also exhibit many of the characteristics of life in terms of evolving and self-replicating and so on. So it's a very complex question. So I think trying to understand both what is life, how can we define it, and how does it arise became really my overriding scientific passion, really, that just led me to focus more and more on this topic. And I don't know if we're going to get definite answers to this. In some cases, I think the nature of science is not to actually arrive at an answer, but to understand that the question that you're asking is not answerable. Maybe it's the wrong question. That's where we can go with some of our research.
Is there any book, quote, or philosophy that has changed your outlook on life?
I've read so many good books. There's books which really, I think, can make you feel more human and more alive through the depth of the passion and the philosophy which is exposed in them. Also some wonderful books of poetry and so on. One of my favorite books, and maybe you've read it, is The Unbearable Lightness of Being by Milan Kundera. It's a really wonderful humanistic book, which I've read multiple times. And then, of course, there are these more scientific books. I would single out one again by Carl Sagan, The Demon Haunted World, which is about the nature of science versus superstition, which is a very interesting, thought-provoking book, and I would recommend it to all your listeners. But those are two that I can think of, and I would encourage everybody just to keep reading as much as possible, because it's a great way to find out, not just to have pleasure, but also to learn about the thinking and philosophy of many other people that you cannot otherwise be exposed to.
Do you believe in an afterlife?
I'll just answer that one quickly and say that for me, no, I don't believe in an afterlife. And I think for some people this is somewhat of a terrifying outcome. But for me, what it does is it means that every day is precious. Every day of your life is precious. And it means that you have a responsibility to try to do as much as you can every minute of your life, and maybe not wait thinking that you're going to have another life afterwards, or be in an afterlife, or be reincarnated, or many of these other things. That you have one life to do the best you can and make the most of it while you're there, and that has its own kind of liberation and responsibility.
If it were an ideal world, what would that look like in your eyes?
I think anybody who's listening to this podcast now understands that our world has a lot of troubles, wars and conflicts going on many different levels, even internally with the United States, and conflict between this country and other countries and many other countries around the world. You see a lot of human suffering. And in the ideal world, I think people would be more open-minded towards those that are not necessarily part of their own close community. And a lot of conflict, I think, is driven by fears of other groups, of other people, of other ideas. And even in some cases, other religions can come in conflict with different interpretations of the meaning of life. And I would think that in the ideal world, people would be much more tolerant of others and not feel threatened by other groups. That, yes, you can still have your own community and have your own groups and your own beliefs and culture and so on, and you don't have to feel threatened that the other groups are going to take that away from you. That you can still have that, but live side by side in peace. Having more tolerance, I think, would be the most wonderful thing.
Thank you. That's perfectly said, I would say. What is something that you would like the world to know about you, which you feel is often misunderstood?
Oh, yeah, I don't know if there are some things which are completely misunderstood. I know that just being as a scientist, sometimes there are people who are thinking that you're involved in some cover-up of UFOs or knowledge of alien life or something like that, or the moon landings or something like this. And I can tell you there's no cover-ups that I'm aware of. If that's a misunderstanding, I hope we can clear it up right now. They say it's hard to keep a secret with more than two people. If you have three people, then it's not a secret anymore. So I think you could understand that if there were any very big secrets within science, they wouldn't last very long. They would be out there very quickly. Scientists are, to my knowledge, not involved in any conspiracies of hiding anything about alien life or anything like that. Having said that, there are definitely some scientists, unfortunately, who have been unethical and have conducted research with fabrications, and that's something we deal with in our community. I think, unfortunately, that has led to some distrust, and as the scientific community, we try our best to keep a clean house, and when those things arise, we tell people about them, but then, of course, that also leads to some people questioning whether all of science is just a fiction. There's less than 1%, I think, of people who are unethical, and you can probably find that in all fields, and maybe even more so in other fields of life. Scientists as a whole are quite obsessed with factual things and evidence and truth. So when things like that happen, they do get exposed. I don't think there's any big conspiracies, unfortunately, that are still hiding that I'm aware of.
Do you feel that science can explain pretty much anything?
We definitely cannot explain everything right now. I think over time, one way to look at it is you can look on it as if you have a lamp which is shining on a part of a room, there's part of the room which is illuminated, and then there's a bigger part of the room which is not illuminated. And over time, if you were able to turn up an intensity of that lamp through some dimming switch or something, then the light would gradually expand in terms of what it's covering. That's a good way to look at science, is that it's a sort of expanding cone of knowledge. So definitely, for one thing, we cannot explain everything. Then there's the question of, could we eventually explain everything? Well, we don't even know how big the problem is. We don't know how big the room is that we're trying to illuminate. So it's hard to answer that. And of course, there are some very fundamental limitations to the application of science, which were only discovered in the 20th century. One of them in quantum mechanics is about there's fundamental uncertainties which come in to the scientific world. Then in mathematics, there's a famous theorem by Goddard, the incompleteness theorem, which showed that any formulas in mathematics cannot explain everything which is possible to explain. So in that sense, we may not ever be able to explain everything, but I think we can explain many more things than we currently understand. And in all realms of human life, I don't know if we'll ever get to understand where the universe started. That's such a difficult, fundamental question. I hope we'll get closer to understanding how did life emerge. And I very much think that we will learn a lot more about medical science and about the human body that will enable us to solve some of the healthcare problems which are devastating, I would say, today. And I always feel very hopeful when I hear about new advances. And I know we still have a long way to go with some illnesses which are afflicting people right now. We still have some very big topics to tackle. But I feel that with the help of science, we can actually make a lot of progress on those. And with medical science, I'm optimistic that we can eventually get to the point where we can have personalized medicine and really be able to use our knowledge of genetics to help afflictions which afflict individual people and give them a better health span in their lifespan.
From your entire journey in life so far, what would you like to share with our listeners which you feel would be helpful to them?
Yeah. Everything has its highs and lows. I would say there's a lot of unexpected events around every corner. And certainly in my life, I've experienced some wonderful, positive experiences, and probably like other people, I've had personal tragedies which have come along from time to time. And I think when you're in that moment, whether it's a high or a low, trying to take the longer view can be very stabilizing to your life and make you feel less caught up in this kind of roller coaster ride, which can be very tough to deal with at times. Actually, I'm sure everyone has had this feeling of being on this roller coaster. Taking the longer term view and thinking, how will this triumph or disaster affect me like 1 year or 3 years or 5 years from now, can really help you. So I'd say just take a step back. I think you have to make time and space in your life to calm your mind down, whether you consider that to be a formalized kind of meditation process, or whether it's simply just going for a long walk and letting your mind roam where it will, let all those thoughts escape, which are troubling you, and then come back. And some people love to walk along a beach and just listen to the noise of the ocean waves. That's something I like to do, actually, if I'm close to the ocean, which I'm not very often, but I find it very calming. And going back to nature and then just understanding that your place is not as significant sometimes as we think it is. And that can be quite a calming thing. For my journey of life, it's just, that's the message, is really just trying to have a better, I would say, tolerance of those highs and lows which come along.
Thank you so much, Conor, for sharing your story and your perspective with me and everybody else. I know that I will look at things with an added perspective, and this has been wonderful. If there's anything else you would like to share or say or anything at all, it's all yours.
Well, I want to thank you, Summer, for, first of all, inviting me to share my life experiences. I feel that I have some unique things that have happened to me in my life, which maybe haven't been common to all your listeners, but also I have some shared life experiences, which I think are shared by many people. And in the process of thinking about the questions that you brought up today have been very thought-provoking for me, and will probably give me quite a lot of thinking to do and reflection going forward. So it's been a really enjoyable conversation, and I think you're doing a wonderful thing with your podcast, and I wish you all the success with it.
Thank you so much. To know more about what I do and offer, visit my website, samroshni.com, or find me on Instagram at samroshni coaching. Thank you.